Today, I'll be trying to make this Coleman Mach 3 air conditioner in my RV less noisy. Because before I attempted this fix, after a long season of not using it, the AC reminded me of an idling diesel engine, which is very unlike how it sounded in the previous season. That is to say, it used to also be loud as hell, but more manageably so. So here's how I got it to sound manageable again. First, I turned the AC off, and then I turned off its breaker. To be absolutely safe from unintentional air conditioner startup, disconnect shore power, as well as the positive terminal on your house battery. As you get to disassembly, be sure to take generous amounts of photos for reference. Up on the RV's roof, I started by removing the shroud held by 4 Phillips screws. Then I slowly pushed the shroud up over the radiator from the back before removing it altogether. The first thing that was revealed was the motor assembly. I spun it and heard a very slight grinding sound, but no smoking gun. I turned everything back on and touched things I felt may have the potential to be rattling. Things like tubes against metal, the compressor, vibrating plastics, loose sheet metal, and so on. I didn't find anything notable, so I turned everything back off and went further with disassembly. I removed all the numerous screws from the sheet metal on the front of the unit, and I pointed most of them out here, roughly 14 of them. Note that some of them may be hiding behind foil tape. Be sure to note which ones are longer and which ones are shorter. From here, I turned the breaker and AC back on and resumed the investigation. Though I found a somewhat loose sheet of metal, which I'll get back to later, I had a suspicion that something wasn't right with the bearings, so I turned everything off and proceeded to remove the entire fan motor assembly. 5 screws held it in place here, and 2 short screws held the support bracket here. I removed the motor without disconnecting any of the wires, but discovered I'd have to remove the fan shroud from the front first before being able to free the motor. There were 5 screws on each side, one of which also held a pipe clamp. This allowed me to free the motor. Before I continued, I noticed that the rubber dampener beneath the compressor was in fact a bit loose, so I used a 3/8" socket to tighten it. I don't recommend an impact gun like I used here, or you may strip the threads. A ratcheting wrench should do the trick. Next, I investigated the impeller fan blade shroud on the inside of the unit to see if there was any debris or an obstruction that the fan blades could be rubbing up against. There was nothing there, so I proceeded with fan motor disassembly. I used a flathead screwdriver to mark where the impeller was mounted, then used a 5/32" Allen key to loosen the clamp screw with some difficulty and slid the impeller off the shaft from the back as to not snap any blades. The mounting bracket was in my way, so I removed it using an 11/32" socket. Beneath the bracket was another 11/32" nut, which I loosened. The remainder of the fasteners at the top of the motor were actually 1/4" bolts, and while I removed them, I made sure not to lose the nuts on the opposite end sandwiched between the motor and the sheet metal because they were coming loose off of the bolts I was removing. I then scratched a mark across the 2 halves of the motor so I could put it back together correctly later, used a thick flathead screwdriver in combination with a rubber mallet to begin separating the halves, and finished the job with a screwdriver on its own. As an aside, this may take some WD-40 depending on the condition of the motor. Once the shroud halves were separated, I gently removed the fan shaft, being careful not to lose the washer behind the bearing, then gently pushed the other bearing out of the housing on the other side, being careful not to lose the wave washer. And what I found was that the bearing on the impeller side of the shaft had rusted, perhaps a courtesy of enduring almost an entire Pacific Northwest rainy season. First, I used WD-40 to soak both bearings, then I wiped off all the rust. I also wiped rust off of the bearing's mating surface on the motor shroud. I did this several more times until the bearing felt like it spun freely. I was in a bit of a pinch because I didn't have any bearing lube, but I did have bicycle chain lube, so I just used that instead to actually oil the bearings. I stood the shaft up and let the oil penetrate into the bearing. I repeated this several times and spun the bearing to distribute the oil. At this point, if you decide you need to replace the bearings altogether, you'll probably need a bearing puller and a shop press. The 2 bearings for this motor assembly were identical. The manufacturer was C&U, and the part number was 6201Z. I'll leave a link below, but know that yours may be different. Just one more thing. Before putting everything back together, this is an excellent time to clean the radiators both on the evaporator coils as well as the condenser coils. I've had a good experience using a combination of a tile scrubbing brush, diluted dish soap, tile cleaner solution, diluted vinegar, and plain water to get a mildewy smell out of the AC coils. I put the two halves of the motor back together, making sure not to forget the red washer on the impeller side of the shaft, and ensuring that the wave washer on the fan portion of the shaft was still there. I slid the two halves back together and tightened the bolts the same way I found them, with the nuts acting like spacers, and screwed the whole assembly into the back plate. The orientation of the motor matters here. For mine, the power cable was in the 7 o'clock position if you were looking at the assembly top down from the fan side. Additionally, there's a special extra long and threaded bolt here at the 6 o'clock position, which is used to attach the motor support bracket. For additional reference, here's the motor assembly's part number, should you choose to replace the whole motor, and again, yours may vary. I reattached the impeller on the house side of the AC with its collet using an Allen key, and did the same for the fan on the hot coil or condenser side of the radiator. Then I fastened the motor support bracket, replaced the sheet metal fan shroud, and put a whole mess of screws back in. Here is a brief tour of all the screw locations, and be sure to reattach the pipe clamp in its proper location. Before replacing the top sheet metal cover over everything, don't forget to replace this loose piece of sheet metal that I mentioned we get back to much earlier in the video. I took an extra step and used HVAC foil tape to secure it down to prevent it from potentially rattling. Now is probably a good time to have a helper test the air conditioner to make sure everything works as it should. I then replaced the sheet metal top cover, followed by the plastic shroud. To finish the project, if you disconnected the battery, now is the time to reconnect it, reconnect shore power, and turn the air conditioner's breaker back on. And so, what did all of this effort win me? Here's what it sounded like before, and here's how it sounded after. The gravelly diesel engine-like sound was gone. Put visually, here's an actual frequency spectrum that I created using a phone app. You can see that in the after spectrum, that huge spike at 121 Hz has vanished, with the next largest peak being 12 decibels below the old peak, which, if true, is half as loud as that particular frequency. My own ears tend to be in agreement. I believe cleaning the rust off of the bearings and giving them some oil, in combination of securing a potentially rattling piece of sheet metal, is what solved the problem for me. With that, the noise went from deafening to mostly tolerable, and we could go back to enjoying the almighty power of Saint Air Conditioner again. Until next time, thank you for watching.